Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to have a look at the methodological aspects of your study. So let's jump right into it and see where methodology fits into the overall picture of everything that we have done so far in this module. Now, the previous assignment that you've just handed in deals with literature. And in that, we're basically answering the question of how other scholars went about researching the research phenomenon that you're interested in this case, communication satisfaction. So we're answering the question, how did others research communication satisfaction? You outlined what you want to do in this research process. And this assignment will now say how you are going to do what you said you are going to do in the first assignment. So answering how you're going to do your research is your method. And this is why this is the methodology chapter and assignment of your research process. What I want you to understand at this stage is that the methodology of your research talks about the methods that you employ in order to answer the research question posed at the onset of the study. So let's have a look at that. You formulated specific research questions and sub-questions or problems in your research. And what you're going to answer to now in this methodology section is how you will answer to the research questions and problems that you posed. Now, if you read Tutorial Letter 101, you're going to see that there's two main aspects that we want you to focus on in this assignment. The first one is the research design, and the second one is the research methodology. Now, the research methodology specifically has 7 subsections that we want you to focus on. And first of all, we want you to outline the statement of the methodological orientation. Then we want you to go on and talk about the data collection methods and techniques that you will employ, the reliability and validity of these so as to answer your research question, the population and sampling methods, the data analyses, the time dimension of your research, as well as the limitations that the reader and examiners have to bear in mind. Now, let's have a look at what each one of these entail. And I want to start off with the methodological orientation statement. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard the old axiom of an optimist looks at half a glass of water and sees that it's half full, while a pessimist looks at it and sees that it's half empty. Well, that holds true for research as well. The orientation that we have towards something influences what we see when we look at it. Both an optimist and a pessimist looks at the same thing, half a glass of water, but the optimist sees it and describes it in one way, and a pessimist sees it and describes it in the opposite way. So the orientation that we have towards reality, towards what we see and what we experience, influences the way that we talk about it and report on it in the case of research. That's what the methodological orientation speaks to. So, a methodological orientation, which influences the way in which meaning and knowledge is constructed by an individual, can be disintegrated into 3 aspects: ontology, epistemology, and methodology. In a nutshell, however, what you need to know is that these 3 concepts function in concert with one another. They work together. Simplistically, ontology is seen as the nature of reality and what the individual is confronted with, what can be known about it. Epistemology focuses on how we come to know the things that we believe can be known from this reality. And lastly, methodology considers how we may go about practically studying or effecting whatever we believe can be known or altered of this reality. Now, in your prescribed book, you're going to see that various methodological, epistemological, and ontological stances are outlined, and you can have a look at each one of those. But, for example, if your ontological and epistemological stance is positivistic in nature, your research will have a very, very strong quantitative slant. Although you employ both qualitative and quantitative methodologies, your main focus will be on the quantitative because you are positivistic in your ontological and epistemological stance. That would be your methodological orientation. If your ontological and epistemological stance is interpretivistic in nature, for example, you will have a very strong qualitative slant in your research and in your analysis, interpretation, and presentation of findings. Now, as you can see from what we described here, the methodological orientation that you hold towards your research, your empirical research, really does influence everything else that you do within your research. Your methodological orientation influences your research design, which in turn influences the data collection methods and techniques. And this has to do with reliability and validity, the population and sampling you will employ, etc., etc. So let's look at each one of these specifically. Let's start with the research design. Now, as we discussed in the very first video, and as is explained in Tutorial Letter 101, you will have to employ a both qualitative and quantitative design in your research. Now, when you employ this or discuss this in your assignment, I have to remind you, for all of the research terminology that you make use of in your portfolio or assignments, always start with an academic, theoretical discussion on what the term refers to, in other words, define it, then elaborate on this discussion with an explanation seated in organizational communication, yet again from theory or literature, and only then move to discuss specifically and in detail how this takes ground in your study. So, for example, if you talk about the qualitative and quantitative research design that you're employing, make sure that you contextualize what your qualitative and quantitative design is theoretically, in terms of the organizational communication orientation, and then how it will empirically be employed in your study. Now, a source that I think really outlines the difference between qualitative and quantitative methodologies very well is Deploy. Now, if you did your undergraduate at UNISA, this book should not be new to you because it is prescribed at undergraduate level. Now, I'm not saying that you should make use of the source as a main source because it was written for undergraduate students, but as you are trying to figure out the qualitative and quantitative stance and design of your research, it really is a good source to have a look at. The reason why I recommend it specifically is because on page 36 and 37, it has a very good example of the application of quantitative and qualitative approaches as it has to do with the ontological and epistemological stances of research. So it really just is a good source to have a look at to see how you could go about practically applying qualitative and quantitative designs in terms of ontological and epistemological stances in organizational communication. Now, obviously, because you have both qualitative and quantitative design, you immediately have to speak about the data collection methods and techniques that you will employ. Now, your methodology is the process that you follow in your empirical part of your research in order to answer to the research questions. But the methods that you will employ is those data collection techniques that we speak about. And in COM4809 specifically, you have to make use of questionnaires and interviews. Now, we already spoke about this in assignment 1, but I'll just quickly remind you again that for your questionnaires, you have to have at least 30 completed questionnaires at the end of your data gathering. And your questionnaires themselves have to have 10 to 20 items. Now, let's just quickly pause here for a moment and let's talk about the wording. Now, why don't we call the questions of a questionnaire questions? Why do we call them items? Well, simplistically stated, that's because not everything that we ask in questionnaires are actually phrased as questions. And this will be specifically in your research as well. Because in your research, as you'll see in just a moment, we ask you to make use of a Likert scale. And a Likert scale necessarily asks for statements and not questions. So please make sure that when you refer to the questions of your questionnaire, that you call them items, because that is what they are. The second method that you will have to employ is interviews. Now, we ask that you do at least 3 interviews at the organization of your choice, and that these interviews consist of only 4 to 6 questions. It's very important in qualitative research to delve deeper into an aspect rather than have a lot of questions that you only handle superficially. Now, for the questionnaires, you obviously have to construct a questionnaire with items, and for the interviews, you will have to construct interview schedules. Of course, there are examples in literature of established questionnaires and interview schedules as it has to do with communication satisfaction. And we ask that you have a look at the examples and the established methods in literature. However, when you start constructing your questionnaire and your interview schedule, we ask that you actually construct from scratch. So you don't just blindly copy what you see in literature. You have to adjust and alter and construct according to your specific research questions. Now, please bear in mind that both your questionnaire as well as your interview schedule will have to be pre-tested, and you have to make sure that you allow for enough time for the pre-testing of both of these techniques. Have a discussion with your supervisor as to when you will be ready to do this. Don't do it without your supervisor knowing. Lastly, also make sure that both the questionnaire as well as the interview schedule adheres to the ethical requirements that you spoke about in the ethics form that you handed in with your previous assignment. Make sure that everything is above board in this regard as well. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the questionnaires themselves. Now, for the questionnaires, you have to have Likert type questions and demographic questions, as is outlined in Tutorial Letter 101. Now let's look at what each one of these is. Now, Likert type questions refers to the scale that you will make use of to test the items in your questionnaire. Now, a Likert scale is this scale: strongly disagree, disagree, undecided, agree, and strongly agree scale. So what you will do for Likert type items is you will construct a statement, a neutral statement, and ask your respondents in the questionnaire to either disagree or agree with that statement. So you might have a statement that, for example, says, downward directed communication is clear, okay? And your respondents will have to either agree or disagree with that. Then the demographical aspects of your items will have to deal with demographic aspects such as age, gender, sex, educational qualifications, occupation, etc., etc. Now, there's various demographical questions that you can include in your questionnaire, but please do make sure that those that you do include are pertinent to your study. Don't include demographical aspects that aren't really related to what you want to know. Remember, you only have about 10 to 20 questions, so don't waste them on stuff that you really don't want to know about. For example, educational qualification might not be a demographical aspect that you really have anything to do with in your study. You would perhaps rather ask your respondents on what job grade level they are so that you know who are general employees, who are supervisors, and who are managers. So employ only those demographical questions that you really want to know about and that has some kind of bearing on your research specifically. Okay, apart from that, what I really want to mention in the questions is the 4 golden rules of questionnaires. These are things that people very often get wrong, and it influences the validity and reliability of your questionnaire. So let's look at the 4 golden rules of questionnaires. The first golden rule is that you should avoid negatively phrased items. This is an example. Having sex before marriage does not seem at all wrong to me. If you agree with this, what are you agreeing with? That having sex before marriage is wrong or not wrong? So rather than phrasing your items negatively, phrase it in the positive. Also remember that if you do include negative items like having sex before marriage is not wrong, you will have to switch your scale around, because disagreeing with a negative item is actually agreeing with the positives. So don't confuse yourself. Just don't have any negatively phrased items in your questionnaire at all. Secondly, don't include vague items. Here's an example of a vague item. How often does your supervisor communicate with you? That's very vague, because my supervisor might not communicate any task-specific communication to me regularly, but he says hi to me every morning. So as a respondent, I might think, well, this is rather vague, because do I count the times that he just says hi to me, or do I only count the times that he actually talks to me about work as communicating? So don't be vague. Be very specific in what you ask. Thirdly, avoid double-barrel questions. Now, double-barrel questions are those questions that ask 2 things in one sentence. For example, this: do you sometimes feel isolated and confused? Well, the respondent might feel isolated but not confused. So how would they answer this question? So don't ask 2 things in one item. That's a double-barrel question. Also, as an added bonus, some people sometimes have little qualifiers at the end like this. Do you sometimes feel isolated and confused, as if you have been left in the dark? Now, you shouldn't have these kind of metaphoric, symbolic, or abstract phrases like left in the dark. Because remember, different people might interpret them differently or might not know what they refer to. Now, this relates to the last golden rule, and that is qualifiers. You should not have any qualifiers in your statements. And this is an example of a qualifier. Do you sometimes feel a little bit? Well, it's hard to say, because sometimes and a little bit is qualifiers. Rather just ask your respondent directly, do you feel this way? Don't say sometimes or a little bit, because different respondents might have different connotations to the words sometimes and a little bit. Okay, let's move on now to the interviews. Now, you have to employ semi-structured interviews, and you also have to ask demographic questions at the end of it. Semi-structured interviews allow you to elaborate on aspects and not be as closed off or as structured interviews might be. So you can employ a more flexible design in your interviews. Now, don't include too many questions, as we say only between 4 and 6 questions, and the reason for this is you have to transcribe your interviews. Now, transcribing interviews means you have to write down word for word what transpired in the interviews. You don't just summarize what your respondents or participants said, you actually transcribe it. This takes up a lot of time. So don't have too many questions, because remember, each and every interview has to be transcribed. Okay, lastly, in terms of interviews and your interviews and questions, just remember that you have to have the approval of your supervisor on your questionnaire and interview before you employ it empirically at the organization of your choice. So don't hand out your questionnaire or do your interviews before your supervisor has not said that it is okay for you to do so. Very often we find that students employ their questionnaires and do their interviews before they were ready, and this messes up everything going forward, because all of a sudden you don't have questionnaires or answers to questionnaires that you can do anything with, because they're simply not reliable or valid. So let's have a look at that. When you are doing research and employing the methods you set out, in this case questionnaire and interviews, you have to make sure that these methods you employ will actually be able to answer your research question in a scientific and trustworthy way. You will need to make sure that the methods of data gathering are actually collecting the data that you are looking for, and that it would yield the same results at a different time. When you are busy ensuring this, you are busy with reliability and validity in your research. Make sure that you can discuss the applicable ones both theoretically and practically as it takes hold in your study. Now, when you deal with the population, you will have to describe who your population is. Then you will have to say, from this population, who are the ones that you are actually targeting in your research? And from those that you are actually targeting in your research, which are the ones that you actually have access to? And from the ones that you have access to, how will you select those that actually then forms part of your study at the end? From those that actually form part of your study, what are the parameters that distinguish them in terms of this population? So when you discuss population and sampling, please look at population in general, target population, accessible population, and outline in detail what the procedure was that you followed in order to sample those that eventually were included in your sampling. Talk about probability and non-probability sampling, etc. Data analysis shows how you will analyze the things that you find from the data gathering techniques. Now, the different methods for interviews and questionnaires apply. Then you will have to look at the time dimension, the cross-sectionality of your study, and lastly, you will have to deal with the limitations of your research. Now, please bear in mind that all of the decisions that you took in terms of the design, the data collection methods, reliability, validity, population and sampling, etc., has an implication on the limitations of your study. For example, if you did not employ a sampling method that allows for it, generalization might not be possible in your study, and this might be a limitation of the study as a whole. Okay, so that deals with the aspects that need to form part of your assignment for the methodology, the method to your madness in terms of your research project, and I hope you have a clearer understanding of those aspects that need to feature in your assignment. Please do let us know if you have any questions, and make sure to have a discussion with your supervisor in terms of the time frame of employing the techniques that you spoke about in assignment 4. Now, time management really is something that you have to bear in mind going forward in the process from now on, because time management becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. So please be sure to have a conversation with your supervisor as to all of that. Good luck with this next assignment. I hope you do great.